Okay, so let's start. So, Michael, first of all, thank you very much for this interview. Thanks for spending your time with us. And also, thanks indeed for all the work you have been doing through your blog. And I'm going to give the address of the blog, the nextrecession.wordpress.com, right?
Yeah.
It's really amazing the amount of writing you do about the economic foundations of capitalism and how it's going right now, and the data you offers and the empirical evidences you offer us. It's really a great contribution to the Marxist and socialist discussion because it is deep, it is full of data and analysis, but at the same time is accessible to people like me, for example, who is not an expert in economics, but is engaged in the struggle to defeat capitalism. And you give us some important weapons for that. Everything you write helps us a lot in the debate, including the debate within the left, right? Because you help us fight illusions that it's possible to humanize capitalism and that reform and not revolution is the way to change the horrible situation of the majority of the people. When you explain the contradictions of capitalism, you make our struggle to build a revolutionary alternative stronger. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Luciana, for inviting me and the PSOL MES, because having read up about you, I'm really honored to be there because you're doing a fantastic job in trying to bring together the militant workers in Brazil and socialists together to try and provide an alternative to the people of Brazil. It's a tough task that you face, as we do everywhere. And it's just amazing how well you have managed to do this over the last two decades or so to do that. And I'm really pleased to be able to have this interview with you and contribute to this discussion.
Thank you very much. It's a collective work we do here, and it's very hard, but we are putting forward. We are going ahead. Well, so let me start reading the presentation your blog makes of yourself for those who doesn't know it yet. Michael Roberts worked in the City of London as an economist for over 40 years. He has closely observed the machinations of global capitalism from within the dragon's den. At the same time, he was a political activist in the labor movement for decades. Since retiring, he has written several books: The Great Recession, A Marxist View, The Long Depression, Marx 200, A Review of Marx Economics, and jointly with Guglielmo Carcetti as editors of World in Crisis. He has published numerous papers in various academic journals and articles in left publications. And I say once a week, more or less, I believe, there's a new article in his blog. Do you write once a week regularly, or you have more flexible time, Michael?
It's reasonably flexible, Luciana. I write if I find something I want to say or I think the readers should know. So sometimes it could be more than once a week or sometimes a little less. But on average, I don't know exactly how many posts in the blog I did in 2021. I think it was slightly less than 2020, but more people read them, so maybe that's good enough. Yeah, but quite a lot of posts. That's possible because I'm an old man, Luciana, and I don't have to do anything anymore. You guys have to work, make a living, put things together. I just sit in front of the computer and tap away thinking. So it's easier to write a lot more.
Oh, it's easy for you because it's not easy for other people to write as well as you write. Well, and the Dragon's Den, what does it mean when we say that you work at the Dragon's Den? Tell us a little bit about this.
This is, well, I think the allusion is to a British TV program where they have three capitalists who interview people about whether they've got a good project that can make money in a capitalist company. It's a competition on the TV. Can you imagine? You have a competition to see if you can be the best capitalist. And the three capitalists interview potential capitalists to see how successful their project might be. And they call this program the Dragon's Den. Presumably that the capitalism is a sort of den of dragons, and some of them have fire and some of them don't. The person who wrote that particular description of my activities was not me. It was somebody who insisted on wanting to put my website up for me for nothing. So he wrote this little piece. I don't know if I would use that phrase, but that's what it means.
Okay, very good.
So I mean, I've been working in the Dragons. I've been working in the city, in the financial institutions as an economist, in banks, working for companies or for institutions which advise big institutions about whether they should buy the real or sell the real, whether they should take advantage of the Mexican peso going down. In other words, very nasty decisions that they're making to make, but all the purpose is to make money, of course.
It makes you a rare person, because we have some professors that are Marxist economists, but I don't know any other man that came from the market, let's say like that, and is there are
very few. As you say, most Marxist economics professors are professors. If they've managed to get a job in a university in Brazil or anywhere else, which is very difficult for a Marxist economist, very few get jobs, but that's where Marxist economics dominates in the academic world. But there are a few of us who have never been in the academic world, who have been professional economists. And I can name a few if you're interested, but they're mainly in the Northern Europe. And one or two of us have been able to work in financial institutions and then also do Marxist economic work. In my opinion, Luciana, I think that gives us an advantage over the academics, that we can see the machinations of finance capital on a daily basis and understand its nature, perhaps more than the academic professors. I have to be careful here because most of these Marxist academic professors are my friends, so I don't want to be too critical of that. But I think I have a bit of an advantage as a result.
For sure, the machinations, to see the machinations from inside is a privilege.
As long as you don't become part of the machinations.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's start talking about your view of the present situation of capitalism. You say that at the moment we are in a depression that is something different from the recurrent ups and downs of the capitalism, the cycles of boom and slump or recessions that occur every 8 or 10 years. In your view, this is the third depression of the capitalism. It's something different from these recessions. The first depression was in 1870 to 1890, right? The second and famous one, the third, the 1930s, long depression that went till the beginning of the Second World War. And now we are in the middle of the third. So can you explain to our viewers the difference between these recurring recessions and these depressions, and the cause of this depression is different from the two other ones that we had in the capitalist world?
Yeah, well, I would argue that to understand the capitalist system, a mode of production is a system obviously for making money. It's a system of production for profit by the owners of the means of production. All the machinery, factories, offices, businesses are owned by a small number of people. 99% of us work for these owners around the world. We only can sell our labor. This is the nature of the capitalist mode of production. So the driving force to produce things that people need comes from whether profits can be made by the owners of capital. Now, Marx showed that this process of capitalist production does not proceed in a harmonious way. It does not proceed in a steady rise of improvement of conditions and living standards for everybody. It goes in a series of crises, of bumps, of slumps, every 8 to 10 years, as you say, on average, since capitalism became the dominant mode of production in the world. Probably over the last 200 years onwards, it has become the dominant mode of production. There's no place in the world now, really, where capitalism does not dominate in the process. A very small number of areas, perhaps in the middle of the Amazon forest, there are a few areas where capitalism still doesn't dominate, but even that I doubt. So this has become the dominant mode, and what it produces is a series of booms and slumps on a regular basis. Capitalism goes forward for a few years, then the profits of the capitalists tend to decline, they get into a crisis, they stop investing, they stop employing their workers, and we go into what we call a slump of overproduction. Too much is being produced that people can't buy, the capitalists are producing too much to make a profit out of it. This mechanism, which, by the way, mainstream economics just cannot explain or understand, takes place on these sort of regular periods of time. But what I argue in my book, The Long Depression in particular, was that we can see that there are waves, upward waves of profitability, which last for quite a longer time, and so that there is the slumps of 8 to 10 years are relatively weaker in these up periods of profitability. And then there are quite long periods of downward movement in profitability when the slumps are much more severe. And so you can, beyond the 8 to 10 years, you can begin to see sort of longer waves of profitability up and down. And these tend to be, in the most advanced countries, around about 16 to 20 years up, 16 to 20 years down. And if you take the whole cycle of up and down, it's something like, and the Russian economist Kondratiev noted this in the early 20th century, something like 50 to 60 years cycle, from one going up and then coming down again, 50 to 60 years. There's a whole longer cycle there, which is driven by innovation, technology, and other commodity factors which you can deal with. But that means at the end of that, the longer period of the 60 years, so getting towards the end of it, when the slump comes, it tends to be much more severe and long-lasting. And in fact, we could begin to say that it's not like the other slumps of the 8 to 10 years that we've seen. So if I give an example to viewers, if we take the period since the Second World War to now, there have been slumps in the capitalist economies, the major economies, every 8 to 10 years from 1946. And you can look them up. They're all in a line. And perhaps the most recent ones we can think of are 1974-5, 1980-82, 1990, 2001, and of course, what we call the Great Recession of 2007-8, and now the COVID slump of 2020. So they're about 8 to 10 years. But what we notice is that in the second half of that period, from about 1980 onwards, growth and development of the economy by capitalism is weaker and weaker. And I would argue that from the period of the Great Recession in particular to now, we've entered a period where growth is really low. Economic growth, real GDP or gross domestic product, the national output of an economy is growing in nearly all economies, much slower than it did in the 60s or the 70s and even the 90s. It's growing in the advanced capitalist economies only about 2% a year. That's very low. And even in the so-called emerging economies like Brazil or others, it's been growing maybe at 3 or 4%, but not even that sometimes now in the period. So this is a depressed period for capitalism. Capitalism is not expanding fast. It's not investing fast. Its profitability is low. Its ability to employ people and raise their living standards is limited. So it's a depressed period. Now, in the book, I argue, Long Depression, I argue that there are only been 2 other periods like that, which you pointed out, was in the late 19th century, from the 1870s to the 1890s, depending on the country. And of course, in the what was called the Great Depression from 1929, particularly in the US up into the Second World War, but also in Europe as well. And it's a similar period to that. At the end of this long cycle of 60, 70 years, we're in this depressed period. And that can go on it doesn't come out quickly. It can go on for 10, 15, 20 years. And so the whole of the 2 decades that we've been through in the 21st century can be described as 2
You have boom and slumps inside the depression.
You have booms and slumps inside them, correct, yes. And so the booms and slumps of 8 to 10 years remain. But what we notice is that when you come out of the slump, you don't get a great big leap forward for many years. It's very feeble. So, for example, after the 2007-8 Great Recession, the growth rate has been in the advanced countries less than 2%. And in the emerging economies have also not done very well either, compared to the period even from the 1990 up until the Great Recession, where there was a higher growth rate. And if you go back to the 1960s, which even mainstream economists call the golden age, from about 1948, say, to 1964, when growth rates were in the emerging economies 6, 7, 8% a year, Argentina and so on, all those other countries growing quite fast, and the capitalist advanced countries are growing at 4 or 5% a year, 2 or 3 times faster than they're growing now. That was a golden age. Actually, it's an exceptional period. Many mainstream economists or Keynesian economists hark back to the days of the golden age and say that's what we've got to return to. All we need is get the governments together to return to this period. But that is an exceptional period. It's really never going to happen again, in my view, unless, and the only way it could happen again is if workers are so crushed by this current depression in a slump that it creates the conditions for capitalists to dramatically increase their profitability and exploit workers more effectively. But I would argue that it's increasingly difficult for capitalism to expand fast anymore. They're running out of cheap labor around the world. Everybody is being exploited to the full. They are not finding the ability to find new avenues for investment that can take the capitalist economy forward. So it's more and more difficult to get out of this depression, this slow crawling pace of economic growth and expansion of living standards. So working people around the world cannot expect a golden age. It's not going to come again. And that the only way it's going to come is either by getting rid of the system and introducing one that's based on the control of the working class democratically, or by capitalism imposing the most vicious repression in a severe slump to create the conditions for them to expand on the rest of us.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk a bit about the law of the tendency of the rate to profit to fall, right? Because I know that you take this problem very seriously. And Marx explains that the most important internal law of the development of capital and the basis of its limits, he's explained it saying, I quote Marx, capital itself is the contradiction in process due to the fact that it tends to reduce working time to a minimum, while on the other hand, puts working time as the only measure and source of wealth. This contradiction is the basis of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, right? And I know that you see this problem of the fall of the rate of profit as the most important explanation for the crisis of capitalism. But I know also that there are different explanations among the Marxists, economists, on the nature of the crisis under capitalism. For example, you and David Harvey diverge about it, right? Yeah. So can you explain your vision and the difference with Harvey, for example, that is well known here in Brazil?
Yeah. First, let me say, Luciana, viewers should note that the mainstream economists around the world, in the institutions and in the universities, do not consider there is a problem for capitalism. Yes, there are things wrong with capitalism. It's either by chance that things go wrong, or bad policy, or criminality, but actually the capitalist system can work effectively and harmoniously, and it doesn't have an inherent contradiction that makes it impossible to grow. That's absolutely vital for them to argue, otherwise they're not going to be able to defend the current mode of production. And let's be clear, that's 95% of anybody who thinks about economics is that view. And even amongst the left of, or the heterodox, the academic economists like to call those people who don't agree with the mainstream heterodox economists. And these people aren't necessarily Marxists, they are really supporters of some form of Keynes. And they say, yes, there are things wrong with capitalism. We do need to put them right. It's not a perfect system, and it requires policies by government to compensate for the failures of capitalism. But when we get to a Marxist view, the Marxist view stands from the point of view, which, as you correctly pointed out, is based, in my view, on Marx's law of value. And what is Marx's law of value? Marx's law of value says this, that capitalists own the means of production, they employ workers, they only produce to make a profit. So all the commodities and things that we need and services that we require only appear, we need them, and they will be produced because we need them, but only if capitalists can make a profit out of it. So there is an immediate contradiction between the social needs of people and the private profit of the owners of capital. Now, why is there a contradiction? The contradiction is not just because of that, it's because the profitability of capital cannot be sustained indefinitely unless they can squeeze more and more value out of the exploitation of workers. As Marx said, there's no value. What do we mean by value? We mean that the things, the resources, the things that people need, if you like, there is no value produced unless workers go to work. We're not in a society where robots make robots, make robots, make robots, and the rest of us do nothing. Human beings do nothing. Human labor has to be, go to work, has to do things in order to produce things. So capitalists cannot get profits unless they put workers to work, and they can only get profits if they can take more of the value that the workers have produced in money, if you like, than they pay the workers in wages. That is the nature of the system. But workers are necessary to produce value. And what happens under capitalism is the capitalists are competing against each other to get more profit. Now, how do you get more profit? How does the capitalist get more profit? Well, he can get more profit by getting more workers in to produce more value. But of course, that means he's got to pay more workers, more wages. So that's a cost involved in that. Or he can get workers to work harder or longer. So not just 4 hours a day, not just 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, no weekends. That used to be the case, but workers have fought against that and reduced the hours of work in a week, and in weekends are generally free of work, but not for everybody even now. But that restricts their ability to lengthen the working day. They can make workers work harder by making the intensity of work, checking them as they come in, making sure they don't go up for a break, keeping them on working flat out to intensify work. That increases the amount of value in the existing time available. But the biggest way capitalists can get more value out of workers is to get a machine which can dramatically increase the amount of units of commodities that are available to sell on the market. So if you've got a machine that does what 10 workers can do, and it can produce 100 times more than that 10 workers, then you've got a lot more product you can sell on the market. And also the unit cost of that is falling. So you can outbid the other capitalists in the market because you've got the most efficient plant. But that means you start to reduce the number of workers you use. So you may still employ the same number of workers, but you're spending much more money on the machines and the factories and the computers and the software to increase that productivity. So the relative position between the investment you're making in what Marx called the machinery and raw materials, you call it constant capital because it doesn't make any value itself, but it's necessary, relative to how much they spend on the workers, is key, because it means that if profit only comes from workers working to produce value, so value only comes from workers, then relatively the amount of value increasing will tend to fall relatively to the investment that the capitalist is making. I'll explain that again to viewers because it's important. When capitalists invest in machines, raw materials, and labor, they produce more value, okay? They expand their production. But if they're investing more in machines than they are to labor, then in value terms, the amount of value that's increased, the total value goes up, but not as much compared to the amount that they've had to make an investment in. So that the rate of profit or the rate of value increase starts to decline. It tends to decline. Capitalists can overcome that. They can make workers work harder. They can invest abroad. They can, where it's cheaper, they get cheaper labor. They can do lots of things to try and resist this tendency for profitability to fall over time. So Marx explains in Capital and other places this tendency, and he says this is the most important law of political economy, because what does it tell you? It tells you that capitalism has an end. It cannot go on forever because it has an inherent contradiction, and that contradiction is expressed in the tendency of the falling rate of profit. So it's a key law from the law of value to the law of profitability is linked together in Marx's analysis of why there are problems in capitalism and a crisis, and also why capitalism cannot last forever as a system of social organization by humanity. It's transient in that sense, just like feudalism was before and other systems. This is the economic reason for the inability of capitalism to go on forever. Of course, it can stagger on forever if we don't do anything about it, but that is the contradiction which exists. Now, having said all that, Luciana, that is a view which I think is Marx's view about the nature of crises in capitalism and the causes.
And you bring a lot of empirical evidence of this in your blog. I
do. I try to not we don't just describe it as I've just done to now. I hopefully describe it better when I write it, but try to provide. Does the rate of profit fall? It's a straightforward empirical question. And by the way, this has been denied for decades by not only people who are against Marxists, but other Marxists say, well, the rate of profit, it's irrelevant. It doesn't fall. It's nothing to do with it. But the evidence is staggeringly strong. And every year it gets better as more scholars develop the evidence. Even this year, we've had a pile of new evidence which justifies the story that if you go back to, if you like, closer to the beginnings of modern industrial capitalism, say the early 1850s, and right up to now, that's 170 years since Marx wrote Capital in Volume 1 in 1867, we can show conclusively that over time, the rate of profit in the major economies in capital has fallen to a very low level now in the early 2020s. Not in a straight line, and it's important to know why it goes up and down. There are lots of reasons that's key to understand, because if there's a rise in profitability for 20 or 30 years, that can make a big difference to what's going on in our labor movement and what's going on in the world economy, because it changes the picture in many ways, which obviously is a political issue that we can discuss. But the overall tendency is confirmed in the actual figures. Now, having said that, okay, so the rate of profit does fall, and it was in Marx's Capital, but it's not the reason for crises. That doesn't prove it's the reason for crises. And if we got all the Marxist economists of the world onto this session right now, and of course that would mean there are about 3 of us. No, I'm underestimating. There are so few Marxist economists. Remember the joke that Lenin made that we could get all in 1950, we could get all the revolutionaries in one stagecoach. Well, the argument is the same for Marxist economists. There's not many of us, but if we got them all here, I could probably tell you, at least certainly 20 years ago, that 95% of them would disagree with what I just said, that they would say that the rate of profit is not relevant to crises. The alternative theories offered, which they also can find in Marxist Capital, they look for them, is that think of it simply this way, and I think many workers are attracted to this idea. The workers produce something, they get a wage, but the capitalists get much more money from selling the goods, so the workers cannot buy back all the goods that they produce. Now, that's absolutely true. Workers cannot buy back all the goods that the capitalists have sold on the market because they don't have, their wages are less than the total amount that's being produced in money terms and sold on the market. Otherwise, the capitalists wouldn't make a profit. So the argument is presented is that crises are caused by workers not having enough money to buy the goods. So there's underconsumption. They can't consume all the goods that the capitalists have got, and that's what causes a crisis. But if you think about that theory, that means that capitalism is impossible, because all the time workers never have enough money to buy all the goods that the capitalists are selling on the market. And then you begin to think, well, what do you mean the capitalists are selling on the market? There's lots of goods that the capitalists are selling on the market that workers wouldn't want to buy. They don't buy factories. They don't buy widgets. They don't buy tanks. They buy goods that we need to consume on a regular basis in the household and so on. They don't buy these other things. Who's buying these other things so that capitalism works? Other capitalists are buying those things. And that's the missing factor in this theory. Capitalism is not caused, has crises because of underconsumption. There's always underconsumption in that sense of workers. It's caused because capitalists find that whatever they're selling to, other capitalists or to workers, they're not making sufficient profit to continue the process, which is the law of the tendency of rate of profit. So the underconsumption theory doesn't work. Now, there are a couple of other theories that Marxists present. They say, well, capitalism's anarchic. It's not planned. It's all over the place. So there's lots of disproportions and anarchic decisions being made and making mistakes, if you like. Capitalists are investing in things where there aren't any money and so on. So it's because they're competing and it's not planned. Well, there's a certain element of truth in that. It is chaotic in that sense. But underneath the chaos are laws operating, laws of value and profitability, which drive capitalism in certain directions. So the anarchic argument isn't sufficient to explain why there are crises every 8 to 10 years. Why are there crises every 8 to 10 years and recurring all the time? Again, if it's anarchic, then capitalism doesn't work anyway. That can't be an explanation. The other ones are, capitalists speculate and cause a crash, financial speculation, the financial crises, that too much debt develops in the economy and then it collapses. All those are relevant to crises, but are they the key causes of crises that are going on a regular and recurring basis? So that is where I think that the best explanation of crises from a Marxist point of view lies with the law of the tendency of rate of profit to fall. Now, as I say, lots of other Marxists, probably the majority, still do not agree with that. You mentioned Professor David Harvey, who is very world famous as a Marxist scholar. He has a fantastic website where he goes through every chapter of Capital, so that you can follow every chapter of Capital and get his lectures and so on. And he has argued over the years, although not always, back in the 60s, he had a much closer position to what I've just said, but he has changed his view over the last 30 or 40 years to the view that actually it's not the rate of profit that matters. What matters is there could be a crisis in the consumer sector. There could be a crisis because the government's up the creek. Could be a crisis financially. He has a diagram which shows various hotspots, he says. And the main one, he says, the capitalism's changed. It's no longer an industrial capitalist economy. It's more a consumer economy, a financial economy. And that's where the crises and the battles go on. He says that's where the class struggle goes on too. The class struggle is no longer in the factory, in the workplace so much. When I say to him, he said, I don't mean it's not there, he says to me when he debates with me, but it's elsewhere. It's in the consumer boycott. It's in the financial sector. It's in rent battles and so on against landlords and so on. It's less amongst workers in the factories and the workplace because that's where the cause of crises is shifted. I don't agree with this particular analysis. Also, I think the danger of it, apart from the fact that it's empirically wrong, in my view, that's the most important thing. It's not a question of I don't like it, so I don't agree with it. No, I don't think it's empirically correct. But also, if it's the danger of it is it actually takes the class struggle away from the battle between the control of value and surplus value between the workers and the capitalists in the workplace. I'm not talking about industrial factories, although obviously they still exist, but in every workplace, the service sector everywhere, the key class struggle surely is between workers and their conditions and the profits that the people they're working for are. That remains the key kernel of a class struggle, and also remains the key problem for capitalism. I don't think they have a problem with consumers boycotting their products, or they have a problem with the financial irregularities, but if they're making lots of profits, they can handle financial irregularities as well. The key battle is between labour and capital in the workplace, whatever it takes, and how the profits are being distributed in the exploitation process. That remains, in my view, the key battle. And therefore, the profitability for capitalism is the key health indicator. If you want an indicator of the health of the capitalist economy, what's the state of their profitability? What's the rate of profit in that country, or in this country, or internationally?
And how do you see the strength of the working class to fight this battle for the value and the share of the wealth?
Well, it varies, Luciana, as we know. I mean, first of all, let's say the class struggle never ends. Now, the class struggle goes on every day in every workplace at varying degrees. Does the class struggle generalize into a mass movement in a country or internationally? Not very often. I mean, if we want to, viewers think about it, how many revolutions have there been in the last 200 years? Particularly workers' revolutions. How many have there been? Very, very few. But the thing about that is that when you do have a revolution, a workers' revolution, which is of major proportions, it transforms the world. But it doesn't happen very often. In fact, it's a very rare bird, isn't it? Hiding in the forest. Or to use Marx's phrase, it's like a mole under the ground, which suddenly comes to the surface, but not very often. So the class struggle is always taking place in the workplace and elsewhere, in all sorts of areas, all the time. And the impact of capitalism's grotesque distortion of our lives is always there. But the impact of a mass movement doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. That's the point. It can happen, and it has happened, and the opportunity is right. When will it happen? Well, if I could tell that, I could become the god of the revolutionary movement. You can't tell that. But what you can tell, it's a bit like I quite like the analogy of climate change. That we know that the world is getting warmer and warmer. Climate change is going to cause disaster. It's coming. We can't say exactly when, and sometimes the weather today is looking good, and the next day it isn't. So the weather on a yearly basis is no indication necessarily of what is happening underneath in the whole tendency of direction of climate change and global warming. And that's similar, I would argue, in terms of the class struggle and the workers' movement. But we must try to gauge it as best we can. So we must look at what's happening in the economy, in different countries, and in general. What's the reaction of the working class and the labour movement to this, and all the things which cut across their ability to unite. We know this, and if we're engaged in activists in the movement, it's a difficult struggle. And I would say for the majority of our lives, possibly, there's not going to be many fantastic opportunities when it's going to be transformed, but it could happen. It did happen. I finish on this point. When I was as young as Luciana, which was in the 1960s and 1970s, 1970s, it was a revolutionary period. I mean, in Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy overthrew fascist and military governments, and in Turkey and in Greece, all across southern Europe. We had the American war in Vietnam. America defeated for the first time in an imperialist war that they conducted on behalf of imperialism. That was a dramatic period, and also major industrial and class struggles in the advanced capitalist countries, because the capitalists have found, after the period of prosperity and the golden age had come to an end, profitability was falling, they had it to lower the position of the labour movement, reduce labour's share in order to restore their profitability. So they reversed their policies of being relatively reasonable, at least in the advanced countries, to a policy of vicious attacks of privatisation, destruction of the trade unions, of deregulation of the economy and the labour markets and so on, in order and to shift the invest abroad, to weaken the labour movement in the advanced countries and exploit the global south more effectively. These were measures as a result of the falling profitability of capitalism. That produced a big movement by workers in the advanced countries and across the world from about 1968, the May events, right up until the early 1980s. That was my revolutionary period. That was what drove me into activity in the revolutionary period. But after 1982, viewers will know, or as we went into the 80s, the reactionary period, which is called in the academic circles the neoliberal period, where the real policies of capitalism were restored, if you like, the workers' movements were defeated, both by two things defeated the workers' movements. First of all, massive slumps. Slumps are not good for workers' movements. If everybody's unemployed, then it's very difficult to struggle. The best periods for revolution, these are, in my view, from my experience, is after a period of 20 or 30 years of relatively good growth, relatively high employment, good wages, strong unions, then the capitalists attack you. That's when the workers are reasonably strong enough to fight back and possibly defeat. But if they're completely smashed, as in the 1930s and so on, it's very difficult to restore confidence and unity and build a movement when everybody is unemployed or got very low wages. So depressions are not good periods for struggle. And so this current depression, or the long depression, has not been a good period of struggle. It's been a difficult period. Yes, there have been workers still struggle. We've occasionally transformed the situation in different countries, but it's not been easy. What we need is a period where workers have got some confidence, some power to organise and develop. That period will come again, in my view. But at the moment, we can analyse the economic situation to see whether that's likely, when it's likely to happen. The class struggle is always there, but it takes different degrees of intensity, and only sometimes do we move to a revolutionary situation.
Yeah. Right. So let's talk about you have already mentioned it, but I wanted to go deeper on this matter of the Keynesian policies and modern monetary theory, because you say that neoliberal policies were a way to counterbalance this tendency of the rate of profit to fall, right?
Yeah.
And also that the massive investments in the financial sector rather than in the productive sector is also due to the low profitability of the productive sector. Yeah. And so I ask you about these Keynesian policies and the modern monetary theory that, I don't know, in my view is very similar to Keynesian policies. I mean, despite the fact that these policies, they don't change the system, they are an attempt to fix capitalism, to make it more human, as if it were possible to make it more human. Do you think that in this present stage of capitalism, in this financial stage, is it possible to go back to a Keynesian policies at any moment in any place of the world? Right.
Well, there are two questions here, I think. For those viewers who don't know what modern monetary theory is, what modern monetary theory is, it's a fairly new fangled version that's come up over the last 20 years. Both the more radical Keynesian economists, those are, what did Keynes say originally? Keynes said, capitalism's got problems, it gets into a slump, people don't get full employment, government has to intervene, spend some money, reduce interest rates, and create the conditions where everybody can get a job again. So government should intervene. That's what Keynes argued in the 1930s. Because remember, the mainstream position in the 1930s of the economist was, there's nothing you can do. If you have a slump, just wait till it gets over and then it will take off again. And the reason for a slump, if there is a reason for these slumps, is because workers try to hold their wages up. They should let their wages collapse so that capitalists get their profits up and then we can grow again. That was what the mainstream view was. Now, Keynes said that's totally wrong. There's no guarantee that if wages fell, that you would get full employment and the capitalists would invest again. So the government's got to intervene, even if it just spends money to make people dig holes and fill them up again. At least there's spending put into the economy and we get things going. So if you like, Keynes was against what we now call austerity, holding down government spending, not reducing interest rates, not creating the conditions for people to get full employment. So it was sounded quite a radical policy in the 1930s. Keynes made it absolutely clear the reason he was arguing for this policy, not only because he thought it was right, but because he saw the danger that the alternative would be socialism. The one thing he didn't want was socialism. He thought socialism was a terrible idea, and that we've got to deal with this problem that capitalism's got, which is causing unemployment, and this is my solution. Actually, his solution was never applied or it never worked. Only the World War did that by creating full employment. But the Keynesian view remains that after the Second World War, when profitability was high, capitalism was able to employ a lot of workers. We had mostly full employment, not entirely around the global South didn't, but in the advanced capitalist countries that was the case. And it was argued that this was due to Keynesian policies of managing the economy with government spending and so on. In my view, that's not really true. It was because profitability was high and capitalists could allow workers to increase wages because they wanted to employ them and make more money. And they could even allow governments to have some control over production in order to ensure good growth and good profits. But when that started to disappear, as we just argued before, in the 1970s, then capitalist economic policy changed completely and Keynesian policies were dropped. And we were replaced by policies which argued for privatization, control of the money supply, don't spend too much government money and debt, policies in that direction, which was designed to increase profits against wages. And that neoliberal period. So the mainstream economics argument back before Keynes was restored after the 1980s up to now. But of course, there's still Keynesians around. So if only we could go back to the 1950s and 60s with Keynes's policies, government spend money, then we can solve the problems of unemployment and all the other issues. That's what we need to do. We need government spending to do this. The mainstream economists say, no, if you do that, then profits will be hit. You can't have that because capitalism relies on profits. So there's a contradiction here. The Keynesians believe they can actually improve the conditions of working people by spending the government money and borrowing more debt if necessary. But the problem with that is, this is my argument, the problem with that sounds great because it means the end of austerity. The last 20 years, we've had what is called austerity. That's the line that government debt must be controlled. Brazil's government debt must be reduced. Brazil shouldn't run a budget deficit. It needs to balance the books. And until it does that, it's a mess. That's the mainstream austerity argument. The alternative arguments say, no, it doesn't matter what the deficit is. It doesn't matter if debt rises because that spending will produce more growth and we'll have more employment. And the modern monetary theory is merely a version of that. It says that we don't have to raise more debt. All the government and the central banks of Brasilia have to do is print more real. Just print more real. And as the government controls real, only they can print real. They own the issuance of the currency. They can print as much as they want and spend it on the Brazilian economy, and lo and behold, problems are resolved. Austerity is removed. It's a very attractive argument, isn't it, that we can say, well, we can get rid of austerity. We don't have to have any more of this neoliberal privatization and austerity. Let's go back to Keynes, spend government money, and this time, don't worry about issuing bonds, just print it. When I used the word print, I was attacked by modern monetary theorists who said, well, you don't print money anymore. No, I said, no, I know that. Did you not notice the quotes around it? All I'm trying to say is that that's what you're doing. You're creating money, or not. You're not actually even creating money. You're creating more currency. And how does that appear? All that the central bank does is that they put it into the banks. So the the Central Bank of Brazil puts real into the banks. It just says, with a flip of a computer button, here's another billion. And then you can spend it, or you gives it to the government in the government accounts and they can spend it on whatever. So this printing of money will solve the issue of austerity and take economies forward. But the big flaw in that is, who is making the decisions on the investment of employment, of technology, of trade? Who's making these decisions, and what are they making decisions on? Well, it's obviously the capitalist companies in Brazil and other countries, and the banks are making decisions on whether they want to invest or not. So if you give them another 50 billion real to spend, will they spend it on productive things that will produce more jobs for people, more exports, more production that can meet people's lives, or will they just speculate in the stock market, increase the dividends for their shareholders, buy back their own shares to boost the price? Will they do financial speculation onwards? Well, the answer has been, every time there's been this expansion of extra money, it was called quantitative easing for the last 10 years. For the viewers, that means that instead of reducing interest rates to make things cheaper for capitalists to invest, you give them a load of quantity of money. It's called quantitative easing. So then the capitalists can invest. Well, actually, the banks take the money and they speculate in the stock market. So the stock markets for the last 10 years have rocketed out of this sight, but growth in economies like Brazil has stagnated. There hasn't been the productive result of this process.
Would be a good idea to use this theory if you also control the means of production and the banks. Then it's okay, right?
Yes, if this is what's missing from the Keynesian modern monetary theory thing. I use this phrase. They say, if we just create more money, we don't even have to touch the sides of the capitalist mode of production. It stays exactly as it is before. So all the fossil fuel companies are there, Amazon's there, or all the mineral resource companies are there. Nothing's changed. The private sector has not been altered. All we've done is we give them a load of money and we pray that they invest productively to do that. But turn it around the other way and change the social structure of the economy so that we actually, governments and the public, working people, control these companies and plan, and then we can plan the economy using the resources of these companies. And yes, if we can produce productively, there's no reason why we shouldn't increase the amount, create more money or borrow more money. You can borrow if you produce more. You can't borrow if you don't produce more. And who is deciding who is going to produce more and on what terms? That's the social issue, which is ignored by the Keynesians and the modern monetary theorists. So that is my fundamental critique of not only MMT, to use it for shorthand, but also the Keynesian theory in general.
Right. Well, I'm going to bring you a set of questions sent by Roberto Robaina, who I have introduced for you in the beginning of our chat. Roberto has been studying the Capital and all Marx works for a long time, and he is the main theorist and policymaker of our organization. And he is the one who introduced me to your blog, so I owe him this. Well, I owe him much more things, but at least that I will pay. So I will read the question that he made for you. There are many theoretical debates about the perspectives of capitalism and the evaluation of its times of contraction and expansion. Kondratiev cycles, as Ernest Mandel defended, periodic cycles of about 100 years, as Giovanni Arrighi spoke, secular stagnation, as even bourgeois economists like Larry Summers defined. So 4 questions related to this topic. Comment on your own view of capitalism in perspective and from a theoretical point of view on the issues of cycles. In the 80s, computers began to be massified as capitalist production. What is your assessment of this fact in terms of the growth of capitalism in the 90s and in the 2020s until now. About artificial intelligence, what role it can play in a new expansion, if it can. And finally, what kind of prospects does the capitalist exploitation of Africa open up?
All very good questions, Luciana. I'll see if I can remember. The first one is that I think Roberto is referring, which I've briefly discussed before, the idea that beyond the booms and slumps of 8 to 10 years, there are longer cycles, which we can probably identify in capitalism. And as I said before, the Russian economist Kondratiev was one of those who identified such a longer cycle. He based it on the commodities, production of commodities like basic commodities like raw materials and resources and so on, the movement up and down of prices.
I heard you say somewhere that you kind of agree with this Kondratiev cycles, but you have been you went further, let's say.
Well, I would argue, I go a bit further. I say that the Kondratiev cycle gives us the basis of that. I think there are two factors which I found, I would argue, that first of all, within I think the Kondratiev cycle, which is this 50 to 60 year cycle, possibly longer now, it's been stretched out a bit more, is driven not just by commodities, raw material prices around the world, but it's more driven by innovation and the cluster of innovations and new technology which comes together at certain periods that has a burst of growth and then dies away and is replaced by a new cluster. And they seem to cluster together in certain periods. When the situation is available where profitability is likely to rise for a long period, then a whole load of innovations that are being lying around, discovered by scientists but nothing done about them, are suddenly taken up by capitalists and developed in order to, why they want to take them up? So they can increase the productivity of labor, reduce the amount that they have to spend on labor, and expand their production and get higher unit value from production by introducing a whole range of new technologies. And if the profitability cycle is upward, then they're in the position to exploit these new technologies. So I added to the idea of a longer cycle these profit cycles, which aren't just the boom and slump things of 8 to 10 years, but over a period of 25 years of an up cycle, and then the law of the tendency to erode profit starts to operate and you go down again. So over a 50, 60 year period, you've got this up and down cycle of profitability, sort of within the Kondratiev cycle. I mean, this is a tentative idea. I think the long wave or long cycle theory has a lot of evidence to support it. And it's also very interesting, but it tells you what sort of period you're in economically, or at least capitalism's in. In my view, we're in the bottom half of a downward pit of the profitability cycle. That's why you get that depression period after 60 years. If that comes to an end, then you could have a new wave of profitability. But that will be based on a new cluster of innovations, which we know are hiding away down there. And one that's just referred to by Roberto is the new developments in artificial intelligence and in robots. We already know robots are being applied across the world, but they're still fairly limited. They're growing fast, and artificial intelligence, which viewers know, means basically that human beings don't have to think to make decisions. Computers and other will start thinking for themselves and make the decisions. And they're more than just computers making decisions from programs. They're actually making decisions themselves and developing their own intelligence, becoming artificially creative. That's the argument or theory of artificial intelligence. You've got to this level of innovation where this could take place. It still isn't really diffused. And when I say diffused, I mean it's not spreading everywhere. Artificial intelligence doesn't really operate across the services and industry of the world yet. But I can give you a good financial example. I like this example in my own Dragon's Den past. There's such a thing called a hedge fund. A hedge fund in financial world is where a bunch of very well-off people get other very well-off people to give them a load of money, and then they gamble with it in the market, in the financial markets, not in the horse races, but in the financial markets, to get even more money. And they take they take a management fee and a cut out of all this money they're investing on behalf of others. It's called a hedge fund because they don't just buy things on the hope that prices go up. They actually buy things on the hope that prices go down, so that they're going both ways to make a bet. Now, these hedge funds have to make decisions about what they're going to invest in each day or each week or whatever. And they might sit around a small table like this, because they're often small companies, and make those decisions. Now, there's one hedge fund I know quite well, where I said, well, what are you going to do? They said, well, we're just going to vote on whether we should sell the real or not. So there's 4 of us going to vote, but the 5th vote will be decided by the robot. And the robot sits at the desk, it's obviously a computer, and it gets the information and it makes a decision, and it makes a vote. So human beings can be replaced on making financial speculative decisions, and maybe on other things as well all the time. This is the process that's building up. That's a possible development over the next period, that robots and artificial intelligence machines will increasingly replace human beings in their operation. Now, if you think about it generally, in some ways, it's a great thing. It will mean, it should be, under a social society, it means a dramatic reduction in the toil and hours of labor that human beings have to engage in. Instead of working 40, 50 hours a week, we can work 5, 10 hours a week, because all the robots and machines will be doing this work for us, so that we can spend more of our time doing more creative things, and the jobs that we need to meet our conditions, living conditions, and the world's needs will be covered by machines. It's a great technology, would be a great process. But actually, under capitalism, that's not what's going to happen. Robots are replacing human beings and putting them out of a job permanently, and replacing them altogether, as capitalism tries to employ more of these machines and shed more labor. It's estimated that something like 40 to 50% of occupations that we're all working in now will disappear if robots take over in the next generation. Does that mean that capitalism solved its problem? No, actually, it makes, if you think about the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that means the situation will be worse for capitalism, because we talked about the long ways of profitability. There could be this cluster of growth, but we then would have a very severe decline in the profitability of capitalism, because there'd be less value being produced by the remaining labor force, and only the labor force creates value. Now, there's some economists that say, oh, well, that shows that the value theory is wrong, because there's much more being produced. So it's not true that profitability is falling or is relevant, because more things are being produced by the robots. Yes, but those more things that are being produced by the robots are not making profits for the capitalists who own those robots sufficiently. So they're coming into a crisis. Can we think of a society with no human labor? Yes, you could. You could think of that. But before we'd ever get to that, there would be such a severe series of crises for capitalism, because it's a mode of production for profit. Before we ever get to that it would cause major crises. We can conclude on that robots and artificial intelligence will only become beneficial and pervasive in the world and beneficial under socialism. It's impossible under capitalism. We just create a major crisis ahead of us. And the dog agrees.
Africa, and about Africa.
Yes, Africa. Well, talking about before, where is the global suppliers of labor in the world? Capitalism has been able to expand its tentacles out of the advanced countries of Europe, North America, and so on, North Asia, and so on, into the global south around the world over the last 100 years in a process of imperialism. And that has meant it's sucked up cheap labor from around the world, and increasingly that labor has disappeared. But perhaps the one area, because everywhere population growth is slowing down, working age population is slowing down. Countries like China, are no longer growing in working age population. India is still growing, but slowing. Everybody's slowing except Africa. Africa is completely still, in my view, a huge area for exploitation by an imperialism. Hasn't been touched yet. Take a country like Nigeria, which is 350 million people. It has a very high population growth rate. It will be, by 2050, 750 million people. It's dramatically increasing. 95% of Nigerians are on the poverty level. It's an indication of a massive pool of labor available to capitalism to exploit. At the moment, it's just exploited by oil and gas companies and corrupt government in Nigeria, but other African countries are similar. So Africa remains a new area, still, in my view, fully undeveloped area for capitalism to exploit. So it gives an opportunity for capitalism to have a new era of expansion, perhaps based on Africa. But also means that African population will become a major force in the class struggle over the next few decades as a result. Africa is suffering also the most from climate change, global warming, COVID, all the ills of capitalist society hit Africa the most. It's going to be a key area in the class struggle over the next generation.
Sure. Well, let's talk about USA. I read an article in your blog where you said that the monetary explosion and the fiscal stimulus being applied by the US authorities to revive the US economy after the pandemic slump is not going to do the trick. After the sugar rush of Bidenomics, the profitability of US capital will resume its decline and investment and production will be weak. Can you tell us why do you have this evaluation?
Okay, well, viewers know that the United States is the most important capitalist economy in the world. What happens in the United States is absolutely vital for us to understand because it is the leading imperialist power. It's the largest military power in the world, bigger than all the others put together. It's the major financial center. Even though its relative strength has declined to other capitalist economies over the last 40 or 50 years, it is still by far the most important capitalist economy. So what happens in the United States is crucial for us to understand what is going to happen to the world economy. That's particularly the case for South America, where the United States regards South America as its backyard, that it would employ its policies in. So the United States suffered a severe slump in the Great Recession of 2008-9, brought on by the financial collapse of the banks, which in my view was the result of difficulties in the productive sectors of the economy and the profitability of those productive sectors. After the end of the Great Recession, capitalism in America got out of that slump by keeping the banks going. It bailed them out at huge cost to the public purse, to the taxpayers and the rest of us, in order to keep the banks going. But it didn't create the conditions for fast growth because profitability remained low. So we have, during the last second decade of the 21st century, we've had, as I said before, very poor growth, and that includes the United States. The United States has grown better than the other 6 capitalist economies in that period, but only at 2% a year. All the others, UK, Italy, Japan, France, worse on the whole, not much better. But very low growth rate compared to previous periods for the United States. So when COVID hit again, the world capitalist economy was actually going into recession again in 2019, just before COVID. COVID's slump was so dramatic, as we know. It was really sharp. So the capitalists in America had to do something. They plowed loads more money into the financial sector, the stock market boomed, and also the government started to spend money. They had big fiscal spending to try and keep businesses going, to keep workers from starving. So a lot of money was gone into that. But so that once the COVID restrictions started to come to an end and people went back to work and companies opened up again, service industries and so on, trade began to open up again, you got a big, what I call a sugar rush. If you think about it, in Brazil, you get some sugar cane and suck it hard, you're bouncing all over the place for a little while. At least the children are anyway. But it soon comes to an end. In fact, it leaves a nasty hangover sometimes if you have that sugar rush. So in my view, as we came to the end of 2021, it's becoming clear that this burst of recovery is over, and US capitalism is going back into where it was in 2019. It's slowing down towards 2 or 3%. But the forecast for the rest of the decade is 1.8% a year, which was worse than the previous decade. That's the official forecast by the American budget office. So they haven't solved their issues. COVID has not created conditions. Some people have argued in America that it's going to be like the 1920s, a roaring 20s. At the end of the Second World War and after the Spanish flu epidemic, America had a bit of a burst of growth between 1922 and 29, ending in a capitalist collapse, in the financial collapse. But you had a decade of relatively fast growth in the United States. I don't think we're going to have another roaring 2020s. It doesn't look like it. The profitability is way low. Investment is low. There's a huge amount of waste of unproductive investment in the financial sector. It's not going into the productive sector. So my argument here,
the COVID slump is not so bad as to make a boom come.
That's a good point. Now, I don't think it is. I think just like after the Great Recession of 2008-9, although it was a deep recession, it hasn't created the conditions for a new boom, that's why I call it a depression period. It's like in the late 19th century, which is a better analogy. From 1873 to 1890, there was periods of boom. There was a slump, really bad slump in 1873. Then you had about 4 or 5 years of growth. Then you had another slump. Then you had 3 or 4 more years. Then you had another slump. Different countries at different degrees. So what you got was a very poor growth rate throughout those 20 years, interspersed with little booms and slumps. That's the sort of thing we're happening since in the 21st century of these 2 decades. We had a mild slump in 2001. We had a very deep slump in 2008-9. Then we've had a severe but short slump with COVID in a year. They're coming out of it, but I don't see that we're entering a new period of growth for capitalism or roaring 20s. Why do I say that? Because I look at the empirical evidence. Profitability is low, investment is low. Yes, quite a few, employment seems to be relatively good, although that's a bit of an illusion in the advanced countries, but it's in rubbish jobs. It's in part-time work, low-paid jobs, leisure centre, not in productive jobs, the training that's going to give people career and money and to go forward. And it's often in the public sector, in health and education, where it has to be, and not in new productive areas. So even though, real wages in the advanced capitalist countries, real wages for the last 2 decades have hardly moved. So wages go up, but inflation consumes it. So the real wages view is the difference between the wages you get and how much the prices have gone up. And real wages have hardly moved on average in the major economies. I don't know what it's like in Brazil. I think it's worse in Brazil. You actually had a fall in real wages probably in that period, at least up until since the end of the commodity boom of 2010, 2014. In the last decade, that's certainly been the case. Maybe in the first decade, that's not true because of the different situation in countries like Brazil and so on. So real wages have been bad. So there's no category of growth that I can see which suggests that would change. Maybe at the end of this decade, we're going to have if we're right, if there's a slump every 8 to 10 years, if like a clock if you want, but that at the end of this decade, there should be another slump. There's going to be another slump. Now, maybe that's so severe that it will change the situation. Because that's what happened in the late 19th century. In the end, those series of slumps did create the condition for a sort of recovery. It was an imperialist recovery. Capitalism spread abroad, imperialism, and took colonial possessions and expanded that way in order to get out of that slump. And that, of course, eventually led to an imperialist war in 1914. That's the other danger we have now. As capitalism tries to expand, it faces a very dangerous rival, the old imperialist powers, namely a rising economic power like China. And it's suddenly realized that this power, and to a less extent Russia and others, threaten its hegemonic position in the world. And the United States has decided that they're not there to, the original policy was to engage with China, we'll invest in China, we'll persuade them to become more capitalist, and we'll take them over. We'll get McDonald's screens up in the cities, and we'll control China like many other countries in the world. But China didn't operate that way. They found instead that the Chinese have sucked up all their technology and are now taking their trade and their position. So it's the major 21st century struggle coming up as US imperialism tries to find a way out, and it faces a severe rival. Now it's reversed its policy. Now, at all costs, it must crush, curb, and control China. And that can only mean a major confrontation over the next decade or so.
Yeah, so let's go deeper on China, because China's numbers are astonishing. The growth of GDP, the growth of GDP per capita, the life expectancy, productivity versus wages, reduction of poverty, position in Human Development Index. The numbers are good. So is it going to continue like this and close the gap with the advanced countries? And do you think these gains are sustainable? And what impact does China have in the overcoming of global depression, if it does have any?
Well, the story of China since the 1949 revolution, which threw out the landlords and capitalists in China and the foreign imperialists after a massive war against Japan and then a civil war against the government of the colonialist government that was in China and the warlords, and the Communist Party came to power and eventually expropriated the landlords and capitalists as such as they were in China and introduced a planned economy, generally publicly owned planned economics. Obviously, there were still private sectors, particularly in the land, but a plan based on public ownership of the means of production, which is the first starter of the transition to socialism, the removal of the capitalists, and the establishment of a state which is planned on a public ownership basis. That transformed the economy over the next decades. I mean, it's a great example of what a planned economy, in my view, what a planned economy through public ownership, not through the anarchic process of capitalist competition, can achieve. And it's unprecedented. This is the largest country in the world in population, and yet it's taken nearly 3/4 of its population out of what the official World Bank and others say is poverty. India hasn't done that. India's gone nowhere in achieving that, but China has done that. It's transformed that position over decades. It's the zigzags of its leadership policy is something to discuss, but the gist of the underlying forces of the huge state sector and its planning and the development of industry on that basis. Yes, a big capitalist sector as well, which in my opinion poses a real stress and contradiction for China in the future. But the state sector and its plan has taken the China forward in an unprecedented level in terms of growth. I mean, double-digit, 10% growth a year for year after year after year until fairly recently. But this is the point. China is still well behind the productivity levels or income levels per person compared to the G7 countries. It's more or less on the same level as Brazil now, nearly. And that's unbelievable considering where Brazil was in 1949 and where China was in 1949 and now. That's a transformation that's taken place, but it's still way, way behind the G7 countries. Can it close that gap? In my opinion, no. It cannot do it on its own. It's not possible, even for China, even a large country like that, to come up to the level of the imperialist countries in terms of productivity, technology, and even living standards because of imperialism. Because imperialism will curb that ability for China to do it. It cannot be done in one country. In my view, if we're going to have a society which takes everybody forward, it has to be done internationally. No, not even the United States can achieve good living standards for everybody in the United States reduce the hours of toil and turn us into a society where technology is for the benefit of people and not to dominate people. Even the United States can't do that on its own, because it has to trade with the rest of the world, it has to invest with the rest of the world. And if the rest of the world remained imperialist and the US had a revolution and the workers took power, then it would still be a major contradiction. Although you'd have to say, it's very simple. If the United States had a socialist revolution in the next few years, I think it wouldn't be long before the rest of the world had a socialist revolution. On the other hand, if China, whether you consider it socialist or not, cannot turn the rest of the world around unless it took an internationalist view. China's in a much more difficult position. It's isolated, particularly isolated now. It has friends, it's huge, and so it cannot be crushed. But whether it can go forward to transform the rest of the world, no. Firstly, because technologically it's not going to be able to do that. It's surrounded by imperialism. And also, the political policies of the Chinese government are not internationalist. They are not looking to make an international revolution for the working class. They're only interested in Chinese development, and in particular the development of their own layer of people at the top. So they're not internationalists. They're not struggling to make international socialism. They don't have that philosophy anymore. Even if they did in 1949, they certainly don't now. So, and that's a big mistake, because unless they have that approach, they are going to find it increasingly difficult to grow. They're not going to collapse. They're not going to go down. They can go forward, but not at the same pace, in my view, that we've seen in the last 40 or 50 years.
Right. Well, I know I'm exploiting too much of you, but almost finishing, I want to come a little bit to Brazil. The Bolsonaro government has led our country to a very dramatic situation from an economic and social point of view. We have 635,000 people that died due to COVID and to the genocide policy of the government.
Only the Americans have done worse than that.
Yeah, I know. Unemployment and poverty also rose dramatically, but fortunately, everything indicates that Bolsonaro will be defeated in the elections now in October. Yeah. Although we know that the fight against the extreme right will not end. We will have to continue fighting as all around the world, because the extreme right is a political force that is established in the world. But here, Lula must be the new president of Brazil, and making a class collaboration government again, which we have been called, and we will call again when he starts it, a social liberal government. What would you expect from an economic point of view for a post-Bolsonaro Brazil?
Yeah. Well, if we remember the first Lula government, it was regarded as a relative success. That it improved working class conditions, it was the transformation of the previous regimes and so on. But if we look at it economically, in some way, Lula, and for that matter, Chavez in Venezuela, were lucky. That there was a period when commodity prices were dramatically rising. China was expanding, as I say, at 10% a year. It was sucking in commodities from around the world, not just energy, but all the sorts of food commodities and resource commodities that Brazil produced. There was quite a lot of investment enabling even manufacturing sector in Brazil to expand. The position of the Lula government was, it enabled them to begin to improve the conditions of some of the poorest people in Brazil through the various benefits and so on that the Lula government did. Same thing applies in Chavez. But what the Lula government didn't do, of course, was change the social structure of the Brazilian economy. So imperialism remained, the multinationals remained, and the the big Brazilian companies were not touched. Finance, the banks stayed as they are. Nothing changed in the social structure. So therefore, that was fine. If capitalism in Brazil was doing okay for a few years, Lula could get the resources of that to redistribute some of that from profit towards labor and the poor to some extent. And so that was a typical opportunity for reform, if you like, or a redistribution of resources. But when capitalism in Brazil turned down again, with the end of the commodity prices boom in 2010 onwards, and has continued on this basis until very recently, we have the situation changed dramatically. Suddenly, government had no revenues, and the capitalists were not making the investments required to deliver growth and more revenues. And suddenly, the capitalists are saying, look, to Lula's successor, Dilma and so on, yeah, you cannot go on with these policies. You've got to have austerity. You've got to reverse it. Otherwise, we will get no foreign investment, and we won't be able to invest, and there will be no profits. And they capitulated to this point of view. In my view, the leadership of the Workers' Party capitulated to this point of view because they never had a perspective of actually taking over the economy and doing on the basis of what the workers needed with the plan of public ownership. That wasn't their perspective. Why wasn't that perspective? Well, there are lots of different reasons. You can ask their motivations. I always think the motivation is, you think about it, that requires a revolution. It requires the working class seizing the organs of power and transforming the economy. That's a very frightening thing to do. If you're a leader of a social democratic party, am I really going to do that? I mean, what the hell's going to happen? It could end up like the French Revolution. I don't know. You know, it's a frightening thought. And you've got to admit that it's a big, tough thing to have to do. You really have to have confidence in the class and to organize to do that, and to be confident that you can sustain it, because you could be on your own in the world. You know, like Cuba was and so on. It's frightening to the leaders of the Workers' Party, even if they believe that was what they wanted vaguely. It's not something they would push for because it's too frightening. So they didn't want to do that. Let's take the easy way out. Let's find another solution. Let the workers pay for this crisis, not the capitalists. And so the result was they got hammered in the elections. The right came up. I mean, I can remember, you know better than me, the Bolsonaro at the beginning, well, he's never going to win an election. It's going to be some sort of reasonable, moderate, conservative politician that's going to win. And then Bolsonaro comes up from nowhere because of the shocking situation that existed in Brazil, the extremities of what was taking place, and he was able to win that. It's just like Trump in America in that sense, coming in into office against all the odds. Nobody expected Trump to win. The bourgeois didn't think Trump would win in America. The bourgeois in Brazil did not think Bolsonaro would win. But when he did win, of course, they all lined up behind him because they needed him against the other side. And the Workers' Party was left with, I mean, we use it in the English phrase, with egg on their faces because of the way that they adopted. So what's going to happen now? I don't think there's any period of breather for our next Lula government. We're not going to have 5 or 6 or 7 years of high commodity prices, which are going to provide Lula with some resources in which he can try to improve the conditions and carry through some reforms. From the very beginning, it is going to be a battle between the bourgeois forces who want austerity and profitability for the companies and imperialism, and behind Lula, the expectations of the electorate that something will be done. Although maybe the electorate isn't that confident really this time round. I don't know what we think, whether the poll's going to be high. Maybe the poll will be high just to defeat Bolsonaro, but I'm not sure that working people are very confident that Lula's going to do much. They just feel that maybe Bolsonaro should go. And so it's not going to be like it was in 2004, I don't think. 2004 was when he was in first time, I think, right? It's going to be different. And I think Lula actually seems to think that's the case. So the best thing to do is just suck up to all the other parties and the pro-capitalist parties and try to get some sort of agreement so that I appear reasonably moderate and we can actually do some. I can do a little bit here and a little bit there, which will keep us without. We don't want a confrontation. We don't want a class war. Let's see if we can find something which works for Brazil, as he would see it in the nation. Have I got that right? What do you think?
Yeah, that's perfect. And the danger I see is that although there are not high expectations, you're right, that people want to defeat Bolsonaro much more than they are expecting that Lula will be a wonderful government. Yeah. But they expect some sort of better life.
Yeah.
And the danger is that the frustration on not delivering something better in the economical matter will make the extreme right even stronger.
Yeah.
Because Bolsonaro came out of the frustration with the Workers' Party government.
Yeah. I mean, Luciana, Lula could be lucky. It could be that commodity prices boom again because inflation is booming at the moment, and commodity prices, energy and food and so on, are rocketing. I think that's temporary, in my view. But if you had a sustained rise in prices of commodities, in energy, food and other things, resources, this would benefit the Brazilian capitalist economy. They were going, so that could be another lucky scenario. I just raised that as a possibility, so that it gives a little bit of room for Lula to wiggle. But I'm not sure that's really going to happen this time. That's what happened in 2004 to 2010, but not this time, I don't think. So it's going to be a very difficult situation.
Very difficult for the people that are unemployed, that are in poverty. Very, very difficult.
I mean, as we know, I look at the data. Of course, I never look at you're on the floor, but I look at the inequality of Brazil is just incredibly large. I mean, not just in income, but also in wealth. There's only one country in the world that has higher inequality ratios than Brazil, and that's South Africa.
Yeah, it's terrible. Well, let's finish our interview with some optimism. I heard you say in an interview that you think that the socialist propaganda is going to be easier after the pandemic. Can you talk about it?
Well, I think one of the key lessons of the pandemic has been the complete failure of health systems in the capitalist economies around the world, either to prepare for the pandemic and then to handle it. And the reason health systems on the whole have failed is either they're just private health systems which are totally inadequate, which is the case in a lot of parts of South America and the United States, or even if they're public health systems on the whole, they have been so destroyed and decimated by austerity and neoliberal policies for the last 20 or 30 years. Hospital beds reduced, doctors reduced, spending on hollowed out and privatized, all kinds of things going on in the G7 countries about the health systems. The great welfare state of Europe has been completely ripped apart, particularly in the health system, because it's so expensive for capitalism. Health system, people get older, it's a very expensive system and they get ill. Why don't they just die? That's what the capitalists want. They don't want to have to look after these people. And they also don't want to educate these people unless it's just for the elite to do their jobs. This is money that's wasted as far as they're concerned. It's very short-sighted.
They are useless to capitalism.
Yes, you might say, the Keynesians say that's very short-sighted. They should let these things get human capital up, as it's called. But actually, capitalists on the whole don't agree. They want the profits over the next 5 years. They don't want to look about 30 years ahead. And so these things are being crushed and reduced as much as possible. So they couldn't cope with the pandemic. Health systems were just, so we were forced into huge lockdowns and all kinds of other restrictions, which if we'd had a proper health system and well preparation, we probably could have avoided most of it. And anyway, the lockdowns only worked because ordinary people, realized they needed to isolate and protect themselves, and there was solidarity in doing that on the whole, not entirely, but on the whole. And but what that demonstrated, I think, to a lot of people is that public services are vital. They can see that they're very, very important. So I think the campaign to improve public services and restore public services as public services is a powerful weapon as we come out of the COVID. The other thing is, it appears that because so many people have got sick and can't go back to work because of long COVID and isolation and all the rest of it, and because there's a whole layer of industries that can't get enough workers, and they're being, particularly transport, logistics, and things of this sort. This is forcing companies to pay more money to workers, and workers in those sectors have a certain strength now, and they're trying to improve their conditions and force up wages and so on. Maybe this won't last, but I see both on a political level, the campaign for decent public services is a big political issue, and also on the industrial level, sectors of workers who have now become much more important to capitalism than they thought, and they have to try and meet their conditions. This is going to create the conditions for perhaps new industries or new sectors of workers unionizing and going forward. We've seen very small measures of this in America and elsewhere. I don't know about Brazil, but these areas will, I think, give opportunities for us to expect the Labour move to strengthen in certain areas. But I have to say, Luciana, we're still in a depressed world economy. It's not good conditions for the expansion of workers' strength and confidence around the world. But and another best indicator is how many struggles are defensive, just to preserve what they had before, and how many struggles are offensive to improve on what you've got now. It's a good balance. I don't know. I still think the defensive are stronger, and that's a sign we haven't changed. Things haven't changed yet much.
For sure. Well, I hope you don't regret having this interview with us. I exploited you for almost 2 hours.
That's all right, Luciana. My wife says, don't worry, I know what's happened. Once you get going, you won't shut up, will you?
Okay. I heard many of your interviews in the YouTube, and I saw that you like to speak. So I was confident that you would like to talk to us.
Well, next time you can tell me to shut up, and it's only, let other people speak.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, Michael.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
It was
Michael.
a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.